Hey friends, welcome back to the Maranatha Global Bible Study on the book of Revelation. So we're actually now in the 11th session addressing Revelation chapter 17 and 18, the prophecy of the great harlot. After this session, we have one more to go. In this session, we're going to discuss the possibility, the candidate, that Mystery Babylon, or this great mystery at the end of the age, Babylon the Great, is simply Babylon. In other words, the passage should be understood literally, and that the city of Babylon, roughly 35 miles or so south of modern-day Baghdad, that's where the ruins are, that it will actually be rebuilt. That it will be rebuilt, Babylon will be restored, it will become a grand city of influence throughout the world, and then it will be destroyed according to the prophecies of Revelation 17 and 18, as well as, which we're going to get into, Isaiah 13, 14, and then Jeremiah 50 and 51. So, interestingly enough, as I teach this, my guess is, my suspicion is there will be very few people who watch it who go, yeah, I really think it's Babylon. There's not going to be tons of people in the comments section, upset because I didn't recognize that the clear answer to the prophecy is Babylon. But here's the reality. Although it's not very popular, in terms of really well-known, respectable, careful exegetes, it's actually at the top of the list in terms of preferred interpretation. So just a few names. And some of you may know some of these names. Some you may not know. B.W. Newton. B.W. Newton, if you don't know who he is, he was a student of John Nelson Darby from the Plymouth Brethren movement. B.W. Newton is brilliant. Okay, so you're talking mid to late 1800s. He wrote extensively on the subject of the end times, and some of it is fantastic. Very few people know who he is, but he is basically the post-trib Plymouth Brethren teacher, sort of the version of John Nelson Darby. Absolutely brilliant teacher. Then you have E.W. Bullinger. E.W. Bullinger is considered a hyper-dispensationalist. He wrote one of the books, The Gospel in the Stars. In fact, the next guy, J.A. Seiss, Joseph Augustus Seiss, also wrote a book called The Gospel in the Stars. Or I may have them both confused, but they both wrote books that address the gospel in the Mazzaroth, or the Mazzaroth. Again, late 1800s. Then you had Arthur Pink. A lot of people know Arthur Pink wrote the book Antichrist. Very popular teacher, exegete, author. Interestingly enough, at the end of his life, he actually abandoned premillennialism and became an amillennialist. So that was fascinating. Then there's a guy named G.H. Lang, and probably a lot of people don't know G.H. Lang. G.H. Lang is actually one of my all-time favorite commentators. His commentary on the book of Daniel, called The Histories and Prophecies of Daniel, which has an appendix in the end on Ezekiel 38 and 39. It's fantastic. It's probably the closest commentary out there that sort of aligns with a lot of my views as I lay them out in the book Mideast Beast. And then, I don't care what you say, everyone's favorite, J. Vernon McGee. Good old preacher J. Vernon McGee. He's been gone forever. I mean, he's been gone for a long time now, but they still play him on the radio. Just a careful exegete, just working through the scriptures verse by verse. Fantastic teacher. Arnold Fruchtenbaum. Okay, a lot of people know Arnold, a very well-known messianic dispensationalist, excellent teacher. Again, I don't agree with him when it comes to the timing of the rapture, but he's a man of tremendous insight. Robert Thomas wrote a two-volume commentary on the book of Revelation that is excellent. John MacArthur, there's a lot of issues that I disagree with John MacArthur concerning, but no one will argue that he is an excellent, excellent teacher, and for the most part, a very careful exegete. Charles Dyer, sort of popular dispensationalist teacher, author. Andy Woods. I don't know if I've mentioned Andy. Andy is a devout pre-trib guy, but he's a gentleman, a solid brother, and as always, a very thorough exegete. My dear friend Chuck Missler, who went on to be with the Lord a few years ago, held this view, as well as Mark Hitchcock, Pastor Mark Hitchcock down in Oklahoma, and Joel Rosenberg. Okay, so the reason I went through all these is to say, look, guys, these are some pretty heavy hitters. This is not a fringe theory. This is not a fringe candidate. The idea that Babylon will be rebuilt, it's a very legitimate and fairly, those who argue for it make a fairly convincing case. So I want to walk through some of the strengths, as always, of this view and some of the weaknesses. Now, obviously, this particular view, it gained a lot of steam. After 2003, just after the fall of Saddam Hussein, because all eyes were on Iraq and everyone said, okay, now this is it. This is sort of the series of events that will lead to the rebuilding of this ancient, magnificent city, and it's about to happen. So here's just a few quotes. Again, you probably pull out a lot. This one is from Mark Hitchcock. So in 2003, he declared, "I believe what we are seeing happening before our eyes in Iraq and in the Middle East is setting the stage for the rapid rise of Babylon." Okay, so that's Pastor Mark Hitchcock saying that he believes that the events of basically 20 years ago would lead to the rapid rise, specifically of Babylon in the Middle East. Here is a quote from Joel Rosenberg's book, written in 2005, Epicenter. Excellent book. And in that, he sort of lays out these, what he calls future headlines. Like, we will see these headlines very soon. And so one of the headlines is, Iraq emerges from chaos as the region's wealthiest country. And here's his statement. He says, Iraq will form a strong, stable, and decisive central government. Has that happened? Not at all. It's been chaos, and it is essentially a puppet regime of Iran in so many ways. It's been anything but stable. He says, Iraq's military and internal security forces will be well-trained, well-equipped, and increasingly effective. They were a nightmare, and the nation has essentially been taken over by the Hashd al-Shabi. Western media will refer to them as the Iranian-backed militia. They started creeping in when we were there with FAI, working with the Kurdish Peshmerga in the north. They started creeping in. It's been several years now. They virtually have taken over the country. It's a parallel army, arguably even more powerful than the Iraqi military itself. He says, as the insurgency will be crushed, support for it will evaporate. Now, of course, after this, we had what? We had ISIS. So the insurgency wasn't crushed. Quite to the contrary. The insurgency was explosive and nearly took over. It took over large sections of the country. Now, obviously, that's been reversed. He says, as the situation stabilizes, Iraqi roads and airports will become safe. People will finally be able to move freely about the country. Again, not safe. The U.S. has basically had to pull out, even from the Green Zone in Baghdad, terrorist attacks in Baghdad, even for those native-born Baghdadians. It's been dangerous. In fact, there was actually an American worker who was teaching English or teaching Arabic that was just assassinated recently. Tourists will pour in to visit the country's many ancient archaeological sites and national treasures. In short order, Iraq will emerge as an oil superpower, rivaling Saudi Arabia. Trillions of petrodollars will flood into the country. The ancient city of Babylon, now here it is, the ancient city of Babylon will emerge virtually overnight, like a phoenix rising from the ashes to become one of the modern wonders of the world. The people of Iraq are about to experience a level of personal and national wealth and power they have never dreamed possible. The pundits who have written the country off to failure and chaos will be absolutely stunned by such a dramatic turn of events. Now, obviously, that prediction, because in the Epicenter, Rosenberg makes a series, several significant predictions. He's trying to just say, here's what Bible prophecy says, here's what will happen. That prediction has been a colossal failure, okay? However, now let me just say this, I tremendously respect Joel Rosenberg. He's a really super sweet guy. But I want to say this, in fairness to Hitchcock and in fairness to Rosenberg, these things could still happen. They absolutely could still happen. Babylon very well could still be rebuilt. That is absolutely possible. It could simply be an issue if their timing was off. So I want to be very clear. I'm not I'm not picking on them by reading these quotes. I'm just sort of recalling recent history to say these are the ideas that have guided biblical prophecy by studying Revelation 17 and 18, and through one's particular interpretation, it guides their predictions. Now, what's interesting about this view, again, the idea that ancient Babylon will be rebuilt, and around the same time, I'm going to say around like 2004, 2005, there was, well, actually it was before that, Saddam Hussein began to sort of rebuild Babylon. It was really just like a little tourist trap. I mean, you know, some of the ruins were rebuilt. I think they spent like $400,000, maybe $200,000 to $400,000. And this was big news in the prophecy community at the time. They're rebuilding Babylon. I was like, guys, there's houses in my town that are, you know, like 3 times as much as that. Like 400,000 is not much to rebuild a great city. For example, over in Saudi Arabia now we have the city of Neom, and they're designating close to $1 trillion to begin building it. I mean, I think there are, last I heard, about $750 billion invested to begin this futuristic mega city. So just, again, in terms of, you know, you see a little headline, oh, you know, Saddam Hussein's building something. It was nothing. It was a little tourist trap, and there was really nothing much that ever came of it. It's still a haunt of desert owls and jackals. Now, let me just say this. This particular view, and this is worth mentioning, it would work the best if indeed the beast, because there's always this relationship between the harlot and the beast. And you can't just make up a theory concerning the harlot without considering the beast. We've talked a lot about this already, but the reality is this particular view would work well if the beast were an Islamic caliphate, if it were some type of a Middle Eastern revived empire. But it's really difficult. This is what's interesting is, for example, Hitchcock and Rosenberg, they all disagree with me very much when I talk about the beast empire being an Islamic Middle Eastern empire. But yet they champion the view that Iraq, Babylon, will be rebuilt. It's very difficult to imagine a Western European antichrist coalition that has a capital in Iraq. That's very difficult to imagine. Okay, so again, it's worth noting that this view would work much better if indeed we're looking at an Islamic empire. Okay, so let's work through some of the arguments in favor of literal Babylon being rebuilt. Now, there's some really solid arguments here. I want to say, like, in fact, we're going to look at Zechariah 5 here. Zechariah 5 is one of the more challenging passages that I don't have a real clear answer for. And I'd rather just say that and say, you know, like, I'm not really clear on this. I don't know that I can fully explain it perfectly, but I think given all the different options, you know, this kind of makes sense. And this is interesting. You know, again, with all of the different theories, you'll have in the comments, you go, people are like, clearly it's Rome. I mean, the city on 7 hills, you can't get around that. Peter referred to Rome as Babylon. I mean, obviously the first century church viewed Rome as Babylon. Rome is Babylon. And then you get others that go, no, literal Babylon is going to be rebuilt. And there's some really solid arguments. And I go, actually, that's true. And then others will say, no, clearly Jerusalem is the city where our Lord was crucified. No prophet is ever killed outside of Jerusalem. It's the great city. Obviously, it's clearly Jerusalem, the harlot city. The Old Testament always refers to Jerusalem as a harlot. And then you'll get others that will say, obviously, it's New York. It's the United States. Like no other superpower in the history of the world could muster the power and the influence as the United States to fulfill the, you know, like everyone is dogmatic. And we haven't covered this one yet. And the reality is the arguments for this are actually pretty solid. I say solid, I mean, they're pretty convincing. I would almost say, even though there's zero evidence for it on the ground, I would actually say that of all my different theories, this would probably be, I mean, I don't even know which ones are at my top, but this one's definitely up there in terms of it's pretty legitimate. Another friend of mine, by the way, his name is Dave Sliker. I don't know, a lot of people watching this might not know Dave. He's written a few excellent books. He holds to this view as well, and he is, again, a teacher and an exegete that I respect tremendously. So let's look at some of the arguments in favor of literal Babylon being rebuilt. The first one is Zechariah 5, verses 5 through 10. So let's go ahead and read this because it's, again, very relevant. So then an angel said to Zechariah, he said, "Lift up now your eyes and see what is going forth." What is going forth? I said, what is it? He said, this is an ephah going forth. It's a basket. Okay, so think of a big basket. And he said, this is their appearance in all the land, and behold, a lead cover was lifted up, a lead cover for this basket, and this is a woman sitting inside the basket, inside the ephah. Then he said, this is wickedness. So you have a woman inside the basket, and the angel said, this woman, she is wickedness. And then he threw her down in the middle of the basket, and he put the lead weight on top. Then I lifted up my eyes, and I looked, and there were two women coming out from the wind in their wings, coming out with the wind in their wings. They had wings like the wings of a stork, which is interesting because, first of all, the wings of a stork are magnificent. They're big, they're majestic, but a stork is unclean. So it's difficult to know whether or not these women are, what are they? Are they some type of angelic beings? Are they intended to represent something unclean and bad? It's a bit confusing. It says, and then they lifted up the ephah between the earth and the heavens. So they lift this basket up into the sky or up into the air. And I said to the angel who was speaking with me, where are they taking this basket? Where are they taking this woman wickedness? And then he said to me, to build a temple for her, or a pedestal for her, some translation. I think the actual word is pedestal, but essentially it's referring to a shrine or a temple of some kind in the land of Shinar. They're taking the basket to build a temple for wickedness in the land of Shinar. And when it is prepared, she will sit there, it is, on her own pedestal. Okay, so I actually had that wrong. So they're building a temple for her. She's going to sit on her own pedestal. Now, when people look at this, again, advocates of the literal Babylon will be rebuilt position, they look at this and they go, okay, here's a woman. She's called wickedness. That bears a striking resemblance to the woman of Revelation 17 and 18. And she's sent specifically to the land of Shinar, which is basically Iraq or Babylon. And so the woman, it's argued, represents the woman, the harlot of Revelation 17 and 18. She is being sent to Babylon until the last days. Now, it doesn't say that in the text, but they would say this is a prophecy about the last days, and there she will be revealed to the world as the final Babylon. So this becomes probably one of the primary arguments or passages that is used to support the idea that in the last days, literal Babylon will be rebuilt. Now, the prophecy was given in 519 BC, 20 years after the fall of Babylon. Okay, Zechariah was a post-exilic prophet. So you're talking after the Medes and the Persians destroyed Babylon, Zechariah was writing, and he says this woman is being taken to Babylon where a temple will be built for her. So again, we have to understand the timing of this. Now, there's no question that the prophecy speaks of something future to Zechariah's day. And it talks about the land of Shinar, and it talks about a temple being built there. So this is something that we have to wrestle with. More specifically, it points to a future for the land that involves wickedness and religion. It refers to a temple, i.e. religion, and wickedness. So a future for the land of Iraq, of Babylon, that involves a false, wicked religion. Specifically, the prophecy never actually mentions the last days. This is important. It doesn't actually say that. We know it's in the future of Zechariah, but it never actually says in the last days. There's really no language to indicate that. While it could certainly be a last days reference, it never actually states as much. Also, instead of saying that the woman is being taken to the city of Babylon, he doesn't say she's being taken to Babylon. He just says the general term, the land of Shinar, and there's actually a little bit of a debate in terms of exactly what that means. Most would say it's probably referring to the region of Babylon and Iraq, but some people say it could have included a much, much broader area, like almost all of the land of the east, the land of Shinar. And so depending on where we land on what the land of Shinar means, that could very much affect our view of the prophecy. While the prophecy never does mention the last days, as I said, it certainly very well could be a last days prophecy. Now, here's something I'll just throw out. Okay, so you go, if you don't believe, Joel, if you don't actually believe that it is concerning literal Babylon being rebuilt in our future, then what in the world could it be talking about? One possibility is this. In the 8th century, okay, so Islam burst forth in the 7th century, okay, so the 600s, and then it was turning into the 7th century, turning into the 8th century that that Islam was really taking off. So in the 8th century, the city of Kufa, which is 35 miles south of Babylon. So you're talking, like walking distance virtually to Babylon. There was a city established there called Kufa. It became the initial home of the Islamic Caliphate. It became the ruling capital of this new empire that was spreading and bursting forth throughout the whole region. Now, I talked about this a bit earlier in discussing the beast, but in those first 10 years, the first 100 years after Muhammad died and his successors took over, roughly half of global Christendom was wiped out. Throughout the whole Middle East, Christians were massacred. Cities were razed. It was devastating. And these numbers, by the way, if you go, oh, that's ridiculous, these numbers are based on Islamic sources. When you work through books such as The Conquest of Syria by Imam al-Waqidi, or the biography of the Prophet, Sirat Rasulullah, translated by Alfred, he's a French guy, Ghulam, I'm not sure how you say it. But when you work through all of the early battles of Islam, you work through all of the conquests of Persia, of Syria, and so forth, you end up with numbers that prove that roughly half of Christianity, the ancient hearts, the ancient missionary sending capitals of the church were decimated. And Christianity throughout the Middle East from that point forward became, in many ways, a struggling minority as Islam exploded. So here was the capital in Kufa. And you go, could that be the fulfillment of the prophecy that wickedness is going to be placed there in the land of Shinar? Possibly. Now, after this, the caliphate moved north, specifically to Baghdad. So you're talking about 70 miles north of Kufa, where it resided for about 450 years. Okay, so again, this is a long time ago, but this is roughly 500 years. The capital of the Islamic world was there in the land of Shinar, which I believe the historical Islamic Empire is the 7th head of the beast. That eventually it migrated up into Syria and then to Istanbul. Constantinople was conquered. It became Istanbul. You had the Ottoman Empire that ruled the final 500 years of the Islamic Empire or the Islamic Caliphate, and ultimately, as I said, was beheaded in the year 1923 when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk abolished the caliphate and abolished the office of the caliph. Okay, Khilafa, Khalifa. They're both basically the same word in Arabic. Khalifa, Khilafa, for the caliphate or the caliph. So the fact that the very capital of the 7th beast empire was there for roughly 500 years, that alone could be enough. Could be enough to explain Zechariah 5. Again, it's a little bit of a mystery to me, but that alone would be enough to resolve the prophecy and say that's ultimately what it was talking about. That the very beating heart of the reigning beast empire that was gutting the Christian church was there in the land of Shinar. That's not insignificant. That's not irrelevant. And it's possible. I'm not dogmatic about it in any way. It's possible. That's all Zechariah 5 is speaking of. Now, another very less likely possibility is that the city of Mecca, okay, so Mecca in Saudi Arabia, that is actually what the prophecy was speaking of. And if that's the case, that means the land of Shinar was much more broad. It was a very broad term that referred to all of the lands of the east from the Promised Land, and it could simply be referring to the city of Mecca. That's possible. Again, it seems kind of doubtful, but once more, we're talking about the heart, the ruling heart, if you will, of the 7th beast empire, arguably the final beast empire. It will be revived. This will be the iron-toothed beast with bronze claws, or I don't know, I think it's iron-toothed beast with bronze claws that will trample the residue, whatever the crumbs, whatever's left, that it's coming in our future. So that's a possibility. In the end, Zechariah's prophecy while it absolutely does stir up some really challenging questions, and it does lend some legitimate credence to the possibility that Babylon itself will really be rebuilt, it's just not enough of a solid foundation to build a particular doctrine on, to say, I absolutely believe wholeheartedly that Babylon will be rebuilt because of Zechariah 5. I go, it lends weight to it, but it's not enough to convince me. Let's put it that way. I'm just sharing my own personal opinion. To me, it's not convincing enough. Now, the second major argument that our brothers who hold this view would claim is they would say, well, look, and this is where we're kind of stepping outside of Revelation a bit, but we need to talk about these things because it's incredibly relevant. Isaiah 13 and 14, as well as Jeremiah 50 and 51, and these are some of the longest prophecies in the Old Testament. Jeremiah 50 and 51, super long prophecies. Isaiah 13 and 14, not so much, but they both are these oracles that describe the fall of Babylon. Now, what our friends will say, again, who hold to this view, is they'll say, look, Revelation 17 and 18 in the book of Revelation, all it is an expansion and a reiteration of Isaiah 13, 14, Jeremiah 50, 51. They would say these are not historical prophecies. They'll say, well, they may have had some partial historical fulfillment, but their ultimate primary meaning is the last days. And there's a lot of evidence for that. I mean, it says right in the text, like, the day of the Lord is near type of thing, or like it's concerning the day of the Lord. And so you go, okay, that's not just history. So they would say you have these two incredibly important prophecies in Isaiah and Jeremiah talking about the eschatological last days destruction, fall of Babylon. And if we take that literally, because that's what it's saying is Babylon, then that must indicate that Babylon will be rebuilt. And that has to be what Revelation 17 and 18 is talking about. And again, when you just lay it out like that, you go, okay, there is another very legitimate, solid argument for the idea that Babylon will actually be rebuilt. Now, let's just begin by looking at the context. What is the context of of Isaiah 13, 14 and Jeremiah 50, 51? Is it historical or is it future? And my answer to that is it's both. It's both. Let's begin by looking at the arguments that it's historical. Okay, so first of all, in both prophecies, Babylon is said to be conquered. It's specified to be conquered by the Medes. Isaiah 13, verse 17, Jeremiah 51, verse 11 and 28. It says that Babylon will be conquered and destroyed by the Medes. The Medes are a historical people from the region of modern-day Kurdistan, let's say, the north of Iraq. So to Babylon, there were people who lived to the north, and that's exactly what happened in history. So you go, okay, they talk about things that would happen in the future. I mean, it would to the future of Isaiah and Jeremiah. They talked about the destruction of Babylon by the Medes, and that happened. They were conquered. Babylon was conquered by the Medes. So you go, okay, therefore it's a historical prophecy. Case closed. But it's not that simple. That's not how it works. It actually mentions in Daniel 5, verse 31, that it was Darius the Mede. And it recalls the story of the night when Belshazzar, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, is getting drunk, drinking out of the sacred temple utensils, that which is set apart for the Lord, and he's getting drunk, and then he sees the finger appear on the wall, and it says, you have been tried, and you've been found wanting, and this night your kingdom is divided and given to the Persians, and the Persians and the Medes work together. So we've actually got the story itself, the night that Babylon fell, in the book of Daniel. It's pretty cool. Now, so that's one of the reasons to say that it's historical, because it was, as most prophecies, most oracles back then were, they were concerning the relative near future of the prophets. But there's other very solid reasons to argue that they're eschatological. As I said, Isaiah 13, verse 6 refers to the day of the Lord. Now, sometimes the phrase day of the Lord is used to refer to a historical judgment event, a profound historical judgment event that the Lord wages or levels against various kingdoms. You've got examples of this, for example, in Amos 5, verse 18 and 20, Ezekiel 13, verse 5, chapter 30, verse 3. That said, the overwhelming usage of the phrase the day of the Lord is eschatological. It's primarily concerning the last days. Now, let me just say my view of biblical prophets, and I believe that this is accurate. Before I do, here's a quote from Alec Motyer, a British commentator, one of the best out there. He actually just passed away only just a few years back. And he says this, he says, "The day of the Lord has many interim fulfillments." Some people would say partial fulfillment. Some people would say shadow fulfillments. I like the term interim fulfillments. It means they are a reflection of the ultimate fulfillment. Okay, so my view of the prophets, for the most part, all the prophets, they were most often, now I say all of them, most often, I'm not saying this of every single prophecy, but most frequently, they were speaking of events that were in their near future. You know, whether it be 5 years away or even 100 years away or 150, like it was relatively in their future. And they spoke of local kingdoms, tribes, peoples, but they spoke through these particular judgment events. And their ultimate eyes, their primary ultimate focus was on the eschaton, the day of the Lord, the end times. When I say eschatological, I mean the last days. That's their ultimate focus. The main focus and the burden of the prophets, it's not just to prophesy random things, although they do that, but it's through those events that they are prophesying concerning the time of the return of the Messiah, the birth pains of the Messiah, and the redemption of the Messiah. This is the focus of the entire Bible, and thus the majority focus of all of the prophets. And so I would argue that here in I keep saying Revelation, in Isaiah 13 and 14, as well as Jeremiah 50 and 51, they were prophesying concerning the historical fall of Babylon, but through those judgment events, through that judgment event, they were looking forward to the ultimate fall of something else. And it's not literal Babylon, but it is the ultimate, final, great Babylon. But that doesn't mean that it's literal Babylon. That the Babylon the Great, it's sort of a composite city of wickedness. It's like it draws from all of the different capitals of Satan's empires throughout history. It draws from Rome. It draws imagery from some of the prophecies of Nineveh, or Tyre, or Edom, or Sodom and Gomorrah. It draws from all of them, and it paints this picture of something far greater and far worse, and it calls it Babylon. But in the book of Revelation, Babylon is more of a concept. It's an idea. It refers to the capital. It refers to the capital of the reigning beast empire. It is a very real geopolitical entity, a very real city or city-state that is the heart. It's the fountain. It's the hub. It's the locus of satanic activity throughout the earth. And it's not to say there's not plenty of other cities that are not spewing forth wickedness, but it's the primary capital. It is the stronghold of Satan in the earth at any given time. It is the greatest city of idolatry through which Satan is receiving false worship at any given time. So that is, as much as we're focusing on this issue of Babylon, this is preparing us for next week's session when we're going to wrap this up and address one final candidate that I think is a very likely possible candidate, but I wanted to save it for last. Now, as an example of this sort of blending of historical and eschatological, Isaiah 14. Again, Isaiah 13 and 14, it's this big prophecy about the fall of Babylon. You have this section of Isaiah 14 that begins, it's this judgment dirge, it's a judgment song against the king of Babylon. So you go, okay, well, Isaiah lived before the king of Babylon. He's prophesying this judgment song against the king of Babylon. But as you read it, the prophecy bleeds. It's no longer just talking about the historical king of Babylon. It starts clearly talking about the Antichrist. It's absolutely talking about the Antichrist. And there's even a degree where in talking about the Antichrist, it's almost talking about Satan himself. And that's the nature of a lot of prophecies concerning the Antichrist. It's the Antichrist, as I've said multiple times, is Satan's sock puppet. Okay, Satan animates this human. He uses this human as his primary vessel through which to accomplish his purposes. They are one and the same. The Antichrist and Satan, they're two different entities, but they're working together as if they're one and the same. And the king of Babylon becomes a picture, starts out as a prophecy against the king of Babylon historically, but it just slowly just sort of morphs in. There's not some crisp verse where all of a sudden it switches. It just bleeds into speaking about the end time judgments on the Antichrist. And it says, like all these other kings, they have their holy sepulchres. They have their royal burial places. He says, but you, because of what you've done, because of what you've done to your country, to your people, because of your wickedness, you're cast out. You're not going to be buried in a proper royal sepulcher. No, he says, you're going to be clothed with the carcasses, with the bones, with the dead bodies. You're going to go down into the pit. So the Antichrist is described as being buried in a mass grave, covered with dead bodies, dying a death of tremendous ignominy, if I'm saying that right. Rather than royal respect, he's treated like a piece of garbage, and he's cast aside. It's a profound prophecy, but it is interesting the way it bleeds from history into the last days. And it still calls him the king of Babylon, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he will literally be the king of Babylon, Iraq. He will be, if you will, the Antichrist will be the one that emerges out of this theoretical prophetic entity called Babylon. Again, the consummate city of wickedness. Another argument for the futurity, the eschatological fulfillment, the end-time fulfillment of Isaiah 13:14 and Isaiah 50:51 is that many of the things in the prophecies never were fulfilled. And this one's really tricky. This one's very difficult for Bible students. So, for example, Jeremiah described the walls of Babylon being completely razed, when in fact that never happened. So you go, wait a minute, you're trying to say Jeremiah prophesied falsely? No, I'm not saying that at all. We have a few different interpretive options. One is that the prophets sometimes exaggerate. They use poetic hyperbole to describe a dramatic fall from grace, a dramatic judgment. It'll say all the walls of Babylon will be razed, but it doesn't literally the prophets are not writing a technical manual. This is not the manual that you get when you buy your new vehicle and you go, oh, okay, so here is part A, part B, and the glove compartment and this, and it's not a technical manual. Prophecy is often spoken in very poetic ways. So it's speaking of the fall and the destruction of Babylon, and he talks about all the walls being razed, but it doesn't necessarily have to be fulfilled literally in the technical sense. It's fulfilled in I don't even know how to say it, but it's fulfilled in the spiritual sense. For all intents and purposes, all of Babylon was destroyed. Jeremiah also describes Babylon's physical collapse as sudden, whereas in reality, Babylon's collapse was a very long, protracted period that dragged out for a long, long time. It was not something that just happened rapidly overnight, but that's what Jeremiah describes. So you go, okay, is Jeremiah ultimately talking about something else other than the historical fall of Babylon? That's another interpretive option. Or was he simply using exaggerated hyperbole, exaggerated poetic language? You go, it's probably a little bit of both. Now listen, this drives the Western mind, Western interpreters crazy. We want to dissect the Word of God like it is a technical manual. People treat it, you'll just get some random statement where it'll say honey is good for you. And then someone immediately, they'll launch from that and be like, no, honey is let's build a whole business on honey is the best thing and we should be eating more honey. Or it'll say, it is good for man's eyes to behold the sun. And then you'll get someone say, well, the Bible says it. I should be staring at the sun. And that's not the point. You know what I'm saying? People take things in a very rigidly literal technical sense, and it really just wasn't intended. The Bible, and oftentimes we want, verse 3 here to cut off talking about the historical king of Babylon, and then verse 4, it picks up and starts speaking. But in fact, rather than having this clean break, it just kind of bleeds from one end to the other. And again, this drives Westerners crazy. We don't like sort of this more fluid Middle Eastern ancient Near Eastern mentality. Jeremiah also describes Babylon as being, now this is critical, uninhabited forever. Babylon has not been uninhabited forever. It was repatriated. I mean, you had Jewish communities that lived there during the first century. That's where the Babylonian Talmud came from. Like, a lot of people lived there. It was not abandoned forever. Let's talk about the walls of Babylon, because they're really fascinating. They were so massive at one time, they were considered one of the major wonders of the world. Herodotus, the Greek historian, he probably is exaggerating here, but he actually says the walls were 56 miles long. Okay, so this is a big wall. He says they were 80 feet thick. 80 feet thick. I go, I'm willing to believe in some places they may, in some places, but the idea that they were 80 feet thick, 56 miles around, no way. And get this, he says they were 320 feet high. There is no way they were 320 feet high. Like, that's ridiculous. So probably exaggerated, but the point is these were enough to capture the attention of the ancient world, and the idea that they were all sort of raised overnight, it just simply didn't happen. They have since then obviously decayed and fallen apart, but as I said, this was something that unfolded over a long time. Jeremiah 51 verse 58 says they would be completely razed, completely razed. The prophecy also says that her high gates will be set on fire. Jeremiah 51 verse 8 says that Babylon would be destroyed suddenly. Again, things that just didn't happen. Babylon actually did fall, but her walls were not razed. Her gates were not burnt. In fact, we have some of her gates still on display, museums. And her fall unfolded through a long and protracted demise. So this becomes a challenge, because you go, okay, is it historical? Is it future? Which is it? Instead of smashing the Great Walls, history tells us that Darius the Mede, the Persians and the Medes, they blocked up the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, and they came under the walls. Rather than just destroy them, they snuck in and they conquered Babylon. That's how they did it. They crept under the walls through the Euphrates River. Now, considering the stark contrast between what the prophet described and what actually happened, as I said, we have a few interpretive choices. One is to say, well, he was just using flamboyant, exaggerated hyperbole, poetry, and I'm willing to say, to a degree, that's what he was doing. And then others would say, no, these must be yet unfulfilled. They will be fulfilled literally in the future. Now, here's the problem with this. If that's the case, and if we demand that it be taken literally, then we must expect Babylon to be rebuilt with massive walls, with massive gates. And the problem is today, most modern cities they're not surrounded by massive walls. That's very anachronistic. It's like out of keeping with the way cities are built anymore. They don't have massive gates. Back then the gates would open, you would come in. Like, today you just drive in the highway into any major city. Now, here is what is interesting, which we'll talk about a bit next week, is that Saudi Arabia is building Neom, this massive megacity up in the Tabuk province of Saudi Arabia, and they're building a city that they call the Line. It's like 250 kilometers. I mean, it's like it might even be 200 miles or so, like this long city. And I should have all the statistics in front of me, but the entire thing is going to be a single building, a horizontal building, and it will, for all intents and purposes, it will be a walled city. So it's interesting that will be being built. It's in the process. I was there last October, and I say being built. The groundwork is being laid. It's still very early, but it's interesting. For the most part, cities don't have massive walls, so that does become a problem. If we demand that this is taken literally, we must demand that the language of shattered walls, burnt gates, is understood in a very literal sense. Again, we have to carry that through to the last days. As I said, that becomes a challenge. Consider another detail that demonstrates this Referring to Babylon's destruction, Jeremiah 51 verse 42 says this: the sea has come up over Babylon. She has been engulfed with its tumultuous waters. Now, ancient Babylon was up, on the Euphrates, Tigris River, but it's like hundreds of miles away from the sea. Babylon was not engulfed by the waves of the ocean. Just wasn't. So again, was Jeremiah using poetic exaggeration to describe the dramatic collapse of Babylon? Or is this something that's ultimately speaking of the last days? And I think there's room to say it's a bit of both. But again, that doesn't mean that it literally has to be literal Babylon. That it's speaking of the historical judgment on literal Babylon, and it's speaking of the eschatological fulfillment of mystery Babylon. Okay, and that's, again, that doesn't fit into the neat, clean categories that we would like, but that's pretty much our really only legitimate interpretive options. The hyper-literalist interpreter, who refuses to admit that there's some hyperbole in this type of thing, they must claim that the latter days Babylon will be specifically flooded by the sea. Literal Babylon is nearly 300 miles inland. Okay, so it wasn't flooded by the sea. It's 300 miles from the Persian Gulf, and the Euphrates River is not a sea. You could say, well, Jeremiah was just describing the Euphrates and, this type of thing. But again, to say it was engulfed in waves, engulfed in the sea, it's an exaggeration. So I would personally say that this portion of the prophecy is using somewhat exaggerated language to describe the fall of Babylon historically, but it's speaking ultimately of the fall of Mystery Babylon, which I do believe will actually be more of a city close to the ocean, close to the water. The most reasonable approach is to say that although Jeremiah was primarily speaking of the historical fall of Babylon, he was speaking through those events as he was prophesying the ultimate eschatological fall of Babylon. So as I said, the best approach here is to say that it's both historical and eschatological. It's not one or the other. Let's not fight about one or the other. It's both. It speaks of an interim, partial shadow fulfillment, prophetic fulfillment, but it's ultimately pointing to the last days. Now, let me just say this before I move on. If we demand, we go, no, I take the Bible literally, Babylon will be rebuilt. You have other prophecies that speak of the eschatological end-time judgments on Moab, Edom, on Ammon, on Amalek. None of them exist anymore. So if we demand that Babylon must be rebuilt, we almost have to demand that the Edomites and the Moabites and the Amalekites will all come back. Or we have to try to identify the peoples today that are all of those things, that those kingdoms will be restored. And, that becomes very difficult. In my book, Mideast Beast, what I argue for is that the prophets use the names of peoples that they recognized in their day, and they're speaking to regions. They're speaking to tribes, peoples, parts of the world. There's kind of a geographic correlation. If this is the region that Edom lived, and it's an eschatological prophecy, you go, well, it's probably talking about judgment on this region in the last days. And I think that's a responsible approach to take. On the other hand, sometimes these names, Amalek, Edom, they take on a larger than just this limited little area, for example, down in modern-day southern Jordan, central southern Jordan. It takes on a larger picture, almost like all of Israel's enemies at the last days are called Edom. And so this is the difficulty, is it uses these historical names, but I think at times it's speaking of something much greater, and we don't have a name. We just sort of have these poetic pictures of their ultimate demise and judgment. Now, a few of the final problems with literal Babylon being rebuilt is that it's fairly very non-climactic. Like you go, okay, here's the answer to the mystery. This is what Babylon is. You want to know what Babylon is? And you go, what? What's the mystery? Oh, it's Babylon. Like, meh, nah. Like, that's just not like it. Why would it require all of this effort? Like, here's the mind with wisdom. And you just go, oh, Babylon's just Babylon. There's no mystery. It's called a mystery. If it's a mystery, it should be a mystery. Like, it's kind of just weird to say the mystery it's just Babylon. Like, that doesn't really sit well with the language that's used in Revelation 17. And then finally, the other problem is just ground reality. There's no city being built. There's no plans for it to be rebuilt. And so, yeah, it could be rebuilt in the future. Maybe in 5 years they'll announce, hey, we're going to rebuild. And Iraq is a mess right now. So, like, this is way off. In which case, the return of Jesus, you go, like, it could be another 50 or 100 years off. And that's possible. That is possible. I personally don't believe that. I don't believe we have that much longer. I don't believe we have 50 years. And, maybe I guess I won't live 50 years. You should always predict just beyond when you'll probably die. But the point is, I'll turn 51 here in a couple weeks. So let's say I've got another, maximum 35 years. I'll be shocked if I live that long, if Jesus doesn't return within a 35-year window. I absolutely will be really surprised. I can't imagine that mankind can continue going at the way and the pace, the rate they're going with technologies and digital magic and just so many different things. The legalization and the normalization of hallucinogens and shamanism and witchcraft and the fall. Like, there's just so many reasons why I personally don't believe we have that much longer, apart even from just biblical prophecy. Just looking at the trending of humanity, I think he's going to return before then. So that becomes another problem. Now, let me just wrap this up by saying this. I believe that what Isaiah 13 and 14, Jeremiah 50 and 51 is speaking of is the ultimate last days fall of Babylon, which is what I've already said. It is the composite city of wickedness. Revelation 17 and 18 is speaking of a very real, literal city. We will be able to point to it and identify it, but it will be the consummate totality, the city of wickedness. It will draw from all of the ancient great cities. Again, Rome, Nineveh, Babylon, all of them, it will draw from them, and it will be something far, far worse. Now, what's interesting is that when you carefully analyze the language of Revelation 17 and 18, you go, what prophecy is it drawing from? Because the advocates of this position will say it clearly, heavily draws from Isaiah 13 and 14 and Jeremiah 50, 51. Therefore, it must be talking about literal Babylon. Revelation 17 and 18 is just a reiteration of these previous prophecies. And I go, yes, it does draw from these prophecies. The problem is the prophecy of the great harlot, Revelation 17 and 18, also draws from other prophecies that speak of the city of Tyre. It speaks of the city of Nineveh. It speaks of Sodom and Gomorrah. It draws imagery from Rome. I mean, it calls it the city on seven hills. No one in the first century would have missed that reference. It's the city on seven mountains. Rome was called the city on seven hills. The woman in Revelation is the city that sits on seven mountains, which again it calls kingdoms. But the point is it draws from a lot of different evil cities. And the end result is when you look at it, you go, it's drawing like heavily from prophecies in Ezekiel about the fall of Tyre. Like the city of Tyre, this great trading city, like it almost paraphrases directly from prophecies in Ezekiel, and it applies it to Babylon. It draws directly from references to Nineveh, where it calls her the prostitute harlot city that has enchanted the kings of the region. And you go, well, that's almost identical. You go, yeah. So it draws from all of these different cities of wickedness, and it paints the picture of something far, far greater. And I believe that in many ways that is the answer. By exploring this possible interpretation that it's talking about literal Babylon, it actually gives us insight to understand what we're looking for. We're looking for something else, something far greater, something far worse than any of the previous cities. And so next week we'll talk about one last option, one last possibility. So look forward to seeing you then. Until then, guys, be blessed, have a fantastic week, and Maranatha.